Warm greetings, children. Let us start with a new chapter, A Letter to God, written by G.L. Fuentes. A little about the author. Gregorio Lopez Fuentes was born on 17th November 1897. He had died on 10th December 1966. He was a Mexican novelist, a poet, and a journalist. He was one of the leading chroniclers of the Mexican Revolution. Now, this also tells us that the story centers around a place in Latin America. The name of the place is Mexico. The story at a glance. Before starting with the story, let us glance on the word letter. What comes in your mind? A missive? A long lost tale? A secret? Or maybe sharing one's thoughts to someone you believe utterly? Exactly. Fuentes speaks about belief. Lencho's belief on God. The belief that might work better for his family's sustenance, acting as a bliss on the crop field that bore corns every year. But the page that owned a better story scorched and was seared. How? His fate had other plans. It ruined Lencho's cornfield. But Lencho's belief was stuck. It had a hard root, far within, deep inside the land, called blind faith. The blind faith was stuck on God. It never suffered an ailment. And he spent for himself some time instead to write a missive to the Almighty. His innocence and unfortunately the illiterate birth of dark traits may be caused out of the lack of education scars our conclusion about him vehemently, much later in the story. Now, to help him with 100 pesos was what he had requested to God, much personifying God with no more than a sweet being who would lend a hand to him, so that he could at least suffice the nature made wreck. What was the nature made wreck? It was the hailstorm that the downpour had changed its attire into. But he was replied with 70 pesos only. This caused petulance within him. Since Lencho had asked for 100 pesos and the envelope had only 70, Lencho thought that perhaps the rest 30 pesos were stolen by the post office employees. Unfortunate. He misinterpreted them. He misinterpreted God's decision. So he wrote another letter to God that succumbs our adoration upon the protagonist. Keeping it an open-ended version, just like the story is, let's move on to the next page. Lencho, the protagonist. So who was Lencho? Lencho was a hard-working farmer who worked like an ox in his fields. He had firm faith in God. He knows God sees everything and would always extend a help whenever and if ever he'd fall into trouble. But dire consequences makes him doubt his own genre. What was his genre? A being, a human being. We'd know about it later in the story. This is what crop fields in Latin America looks like. Doesn't it look like an attire to paradise? Yes, Lencho's crop field that bore ripe yellow currants looked much like this. But fate had nurtured it into a dark attire. He had expected a good downpour for a rich harvest, but unfortunately the downpour changed into a hailstorm, and this is what happened. Situation took a different norm after the hailstorm. His productive land changed into nothing more than a ravine land. The difference between Lencho's way of thinking and the employee's way of thinking. Let us have a look. Bliss as if chose a day to be spent in the crop field during the harvest period. But luck had turned a conspiracy. And see what happened. The hailstone had eaten up his fate into a dark day, into a bleak Stygian. Lencho's castles formed in the air fell apart into grain of nonchalance. And children, this very slide reminds me of Sylvia Plath's famous line, "I talk to God, but the sky is empty." And also, nevertheless, George Carlin's line, "Tell people there's an invisible man in the sky who created the universe and the vast majority will believe you. Tell them the paint is wet and they have to touch it to be sure." Yes, children, the beautiful part of the slide that shows us pulchritude, beauty attired from the wreck patch of disaster. Yes, this is what the employees had planted for him. They had at least understood the ruinous character of this man that might have, on the other way, eaten him up. Therefore, they tried to water his immense faith upon God, the green faith that had creeped up to the feet of God's decision. And do you know what did God decide? God had decided these beautifully souled employees to water his dreams that were shattered into nonchalance. And so they gathered 70 pesos, the only they had and they could. But doubt killed the already deceased mind, wrecked in this little old farmer, Lencho. As the other part of the slide tells, doubt kills more dreams than failure ever will. What was Lencho's failure? Maybe the hailstorm that had caused a complete wreck to the castles that he had brought and painted in his own air? But it could have bought for him a better day, a better dream, if he would have decided to paint God's decision into a pure interpretation. But he misinterpreted the employees of the post office. How did God help Lencho? And how was it interpreted? Children, God helped Lencho through the enlightening souls of the employees of the post office who had decided to collect money to help Lencho. But Lencho thought the employees of the post office must have pilfered a little from the whole amount. Such a wreck, children. The bliss that took the form of a beautiful flower faded deep within the crevice that he had borne within himself, that fell deep within the abyss, within the ocean of his doubts. Culmination. Lencho is a simple man of great faith in God and writes a letter asking for the modest sum of 100 pesos. He mails the letter addressed to Dios, and the village postmaster opens it and reads it. Moved by the ridiculousness of such a request, but also by the peasant's simple but strong faith, the postmaster collects 70 pesos and mails it back to Lencho. Lencho's reaction to the money from God, the postmaster and his staff watch for the peasant's reaction to the gift. Surprise turns from triumph to disbelief to disappointment and outrageous Lencho. He counts the money. Lencho writes another letter to God and mails it and leaves. The postmaster receives the letter, opens it and reads the following. God, thank you for the money, but please do not send it through the post office. They are thieves. This huge wreck forces me to end this video here. The very following will exclaim the latter part of the story.